Alright, so if you open your foldable to the top, we're going to be solving for a missing side length. And if you look at that triangle, you can see we're going to be trying to find the hypotenuse. Over here on the left side is just a little reference sheet for how you can approximate different things in your calculator. So say your problem is sine of 30, then all you need to do is just hit the sine and then a 30 button, close parentheses. It approximates it for you. Not very difficult. I also threw in a radian one. I already showed you how to change to radian, so I'm not going to do that. Then, if you have secant or cosecant or cotangent, one of those reciprocals that you want to approximate in your calculator, well then you're going to be using this inverse key. That's the easiest way to do it. I'm going to highlight those inverse keys. Reciprocal keys. I cannot believe I just called them that. Reciprocal keys, because you use it to find the reciprocal. So instead of typing in secant of 30 degrees, which we don't have in our calculator, I'm going to type in its reciprocal, which is cosine, and then hit reciprocal key, and that will approximate it for me. And the same thing works with radians. So let's go ahead and work out this problem. It says solve for missing side length A, so that's what we want to find. And we want to set up an equation to solve for A. So probably the trickiest part is creating your equation. You need to think about what information am I given. I'm given an angle, theta, so my theta is 30 degrees. Now, what side lengths am I given in relation to this angle? So I'm not given adjacent, I'm given opposite and hypotenuse. What functions, trig functions, have opposite and hypotenuse? Hopefully you think sine. So what we're going to write is an equation. Sine of 30 degrees equals 4 over A. And now that we have an equation, we can solve that equation. We're going to try to isolate A first. So the first thing we do is get A by itself. To do that, we're going to have to do a little maneuvering. I'm going to multiply by A on both sides so that I get A out of the denominator. So now I've got A times sine of 30 degrees equals 4. And now I can divide by sine of 30 degrees. So A equals 4 over sine of 30 degrees, which is something that we can approximate in our calculator. So I'm going to grab my calculator, type in 4 divided by sine of 30, and it is 8. Another way you could do it, if you know sine of 30 really well, and that's not approximately, if you know sine of 30 really well from our special triangles, then you can just plug in the value, the ratio known there, or you can use your calculator. So A is going to be 8 units. Alright, now let's move to the bottom. Solve for an angle. So we just solved for a missing side length. What if we don't know our theta? We're going to be using these buttons in just a moment, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. But first, let's start by setting up our equation. So similar to the last problem, we're going to identify what pieces of information we have. So it looks like we don't have theta, but we do have an adjacent side length and a hypotenuse side length. So think about what trig function involves adjacent and hypotenuse. Hopefully you think of cosine. So we're going to say cosine of A equals 2 over 5. Now here's the tricky thing. How do we get A by itself? I told you guys that this is basically like function notation. So if you had f of x in Algebra 2, we never learned how to separate f from x. We never learned that. But in trig, it's useful to be able to separate the name of the function from the input, what's in parentheses. So I'm going to teach you about using the inverse function. So we are actually going to do inverse cosine, which is notated like this, cosine with the little -1, on both sides. So we're going to take inverse cosine of cosine A and inverse cosine of 2/5. And the inverses cancel one another out. So that we get A equals inverse cosine of 2/5. Now, the notation is really confusing because this stands for inverse cosine, whereas that little -1 we talked about earlier, that stands for reciprocal. I know, very confusing. So if you look down here and you see cosine inverse, that is totally different than up here where you see cosine, angle measure, and then the reciprocal key. Totally different. The inverse allows us to isolate a variable in the theta spot. So now we're going to do this in our calculator. We're going to approximate A. So grab your calculator, and you can see I've already got written over here. This is our problem that we started with. Here's what we need to type into our calculator. So we need to type in second, and then hit the cosine button. And you see that inverse cosine pop up there. And then we're going to do 2 divided by 5. Remember, graphing calculators don't have a fraction button, but 2 divided by 5 is the same as the fraction 2/5. Type it in, approximately 66.4. We're just going to round to the whole degree. Remember, I'm saying that's degrees because our theta is in degrees. And that's it. That's how you do it. So we're going to do a couple more practice problems, and then I'll give you guys some practice problems to do on your own.